What if I told you that the most impenetrable fortress in Japanese history was destroyed by a simple bowl of soup? Imagine a prison so brutal that the cold itself was considered the ultimate warden. You are locked inside a freezing cell in the dead of winter. Your body is weighed down by 20 kilograms of solid iron shackles. Every movement is an absolute agony. The door to your cell is a massive slab of metal with only a tiny slit for food. There are no tools. There are no weapons. There is absolutely no hope. But what if the very thing designed to keep you alive was the exact weapon you needed to break free? This is the unbelievable true story of Yoshie Shiratori, the man who defeated the unescapable Abashiri prison, not with explosives or heavy machinery, but with unimaginable patience and daily ration of miso soup. Welcome to Prison Break Stories. Today we dive extremely deep into the mind of a genius and the grueling, terrifying science behind the most impossible escape in human history. To truly comprehend the absolute madness of this prison break, we must first travel back in time to the dark, unforgiving era of 1940s Japan. The world was consumed by war, and the Japanese penal system was notoriously, unapologetically ruthless. But even among the most terrifying prisons in the empire, one single name struck absolute fear into the hearts of the most hardened criminals: Abashiri. Located on the extreme northern coast of Hokkaido, facing the freezing, violent waters of the Sea of Okhotsk, Abashiri was not just a maximum security prison. It was a frozen hell on earth. It was specifically constructed at the end of the 19th century to completely isolate the most dangerous, unredeemable enemies of the state. The geographical isolation was its very first layer of impenetrable defense. To escape the walls of Abashiri meant stepping out into a desolate, lethal wasteland of raging blizzards, sub-zero temperatures, and trackless, blinding snowfields that stretched continuously for hundreds of miles in every direction. But the geography was only the beginning of the nightmare. The architecture of the prison itself was meticulously designed to break the human spirit. The cell blocks were built in a highly efficient radial layout, allowing a single, heavily armed guard in the central watchtower to monitor every single long, dark corridor simultaneously. The walls were constructed of thick, heavy brick and mortar, reinforced heavily with imported steel. The windows were placed high near the ceiling, painfully narrow, and barred with incredibly heavy iron grates that sank deep into the stone masonry. There was absolutely no central heating. During the brutal, legendary Hokkaido winters, the temperatures inside the uninsulated cells would routinely plummet to minus 20 degrees Celsius or even lower. The moisture from the prisoners' own terrified breath would quickly freeze on the cold stone walls, creating a shimmering, claustrophobic tomb of solid ice. Inmates were provided with only the thinnest, most pathetic cotton uniforms, offering absolutely no defense against the creeping, lethal cold. Frostbite was not just a theoretical risk. It was an accepted, horrifying reality of daily life inside those walls. Prisoners would regularly lose toes, fingers, and sections of their noses to the freezing air while they slept. To survive a single grueling winter in Abashiri required an iron will and a desperate clinging to life. To attempt an actual escape from it was considered an act of pure, unadulterated suicide. And it was exactly into this absolute freezing nightmare that Yoshie Shiratori was dragged in 1943. But to understand exactly why the heavily armed guards at Abashiri were so utterly, visibly terrified of this one single man, you have to closely examine his terrifying resume. Yoshie Shiratori was not a typical run-of-the-mill inmate. By the time he set foot in the snowy courtyard of Abashiri, he was already a living, breathing legend in the Japanese criminal underworld. He possessed a physical agility that seemingly defied logic and an intellect that was dangerously, quietly sharp. He had already accomplished the impossible by escaping from 3 different maximum security prisons, with each breakout being significantly more audacious and unbelievable than the last. In his very first escape from Aomori prison in 1936, he patiently picked the complicated lock of his cell door, using nothing more than a short, stiff piece of wire he secretly extracted from a wooden bathing bucket. He had meticulously memorized the exact patrol routes and timings of the guards by intensely listening to the sound of their footsteps alone. In his second terrifying escape from Akita prison in 1942, he somehow managed to climb the completely smooth copper-lined walls of his solitary confinement cell, scaling the sheer, impossible vertical surface like an insect, before violently breaking through a reinforced skylight. By the time he was finally captured again and sent to the frozen hell of Abashiri, The authorities had starkly realized that standard containment protocols simply did not apply to a man like him. He was a phantom, a man who could seemingly dissolve through solid matter and vanish into thin air. The warden of Abashiri was absolutely determined that his highly secure facility would be the final place where the growing legend of Yoshie Shiratori finally died. They were not going to take any chances whatsoever. Standard prison handcuffs were immediately deemed completely useless. Normal barred cell doors were considered far too vulnerable for a man of his unique talents. The administration took drastic measures and commissioned a master blacksmith to forge a completely unique, terrifying set of restraints designed specifically and exclusively for Shiratori. These were not the flexible, lightweight chain-link cuffs you might see in modern prisons. They were massive, incredibly rigid blocks of solid cast iron. The leg irons alone weighed over 10 kilograms. The handcuffs were another 10 kilograms of immovable, heavy metal. In total, Shiratori was forced to constantly wear 20 kilograms of solid iron directly on his bare flesh. The metal was thick, unforgiving, and securely fastened with heavy, customized bolts that required a highly specialized tool to open. Once they were hammered shut, they were entirely permanent. They bolted these monstrosities incredibly tightly around his wrists and ankles, intentionally making them far too tight so that the freezing cold metal would bite deeply and constantly into his skin, completely cutting off circulation and causing agonizing, weeping open sores. The immense, crushing weight was a brutal form of continuous, inescapable physical torture. Every single tiny movement required monumental, exhausting effort. He could not stand up completely straight. Walking was reduced to a pathetic, agonizing, painfully slow shuffle, violently dragging the massive iron weights across the freezing, unforgiving stone floor. When it was finally time to eat his meager rations, he was forced to bend his head all the way down to the floor like a wild animal, because the incredibly rigid iron cuffs entirely prevented him from raising his hands anywhere near his mouth. The psychological degradation was absolute and complete. But the horrifying physical restraints were only half of the nightmare they had prepared for him. They violently threw him into a specialized solitary confinement cell located in the deepest, darkest, and absolutely coldest sector of the entire prison. The door to this specific cell was not made of standard iron bars. It was a solid, massive, impenetrable slab of steel and iron. The only possible opening to the outside world was a tiny, heavily reinforced rectangular slit positioned near the bottom, just barely large enough for a guard to quickly slide a thin wooden tray of food through. There was no natural light. There was absolutely no sound. There was only the creeping, biting, lethal frost and the crushing, unbearable weight of the iron constantly dragging him down into the depths of madness. The guards watched him like completely paranoid hawks. They closely monitored his every single shivering breath. They stood silently outside his heavy steel door, listening intently to the agonizing rhythmic clank of his chains whenever he desperately tried to shift his freezing weight on the stone floor. They smiled confidently to themselves in the dim, flickering light of the corridor. They truly, deeply believed they had finally won the war against the King of Escapes. They believed they had perfectly engineered a cage so brutal, so freezing, and so absolutely impenetrable that not even the great Yoshie Shiratori could ever hope to survive, let alone escape. They thought they had finally caged a permanently broken man. But they entirely failed to understand the incredible, terrifying mind of the prisoner they were holding. They viciously stripped him of his dignity. They completely stripped him of any possible tools, wires, or lockpicks. They stripped him of all conceivable hope. But in their supreme, blinding arrogance, they made one critical, absolutely fatal miscalculation. In order to keep him barely alive to suffer, they had to feed him every day. And in the very food they carelessly gave him lay the ultimate invisible weapon of their own destruction. Fa, yai, et hai, and I side into suentars kai. Jubov. Non-voiceover, 100% plain text. Tiing NIS, toy, tiet, tuish bent. Fadas ye fata tamda. Nis to vetata and tuish bent to tak tuishan. And fanaza fata tues metum mod no, wush ben siet, a niche moish, hakush ben makush, tuish bend. And fata si fosh, kabush modan. The Stabin Sazman Variant Kritain. In fine Gedives, every single day, with absolute terrifying regularity, the heavily armed guards slid a meager, pathetic ration of food through the tiny rusted slit at the bottom of his massive steel door. A small, cold bowl of plain white rice and a small steaming bowl of traditional Japanese miso soup for literally any other starving, broken man trapped in that freezing, lightless abyss. That small bowl of soup was nothing more than a few fleeting seconds of precious, life-saving warmth. A momentary, desperate escape from the biting, relentless cold that constantly threatened to stop his heart from beating. But Yoshie Shiratori was not like any other man. He looked at that dark, salty, steaming broth, and he saw something completely, fundamentally different. He saw his only salvation. He possessed a terrifyingly sharp, almost predatory understanding of the physical world around him. He deeply understood the slow, completely invisible, and absolutely unstoppable power of basic chemistry. Miso soup, as a traditional fermented dish, is famously packed with an incredibly high concentrated amount of sodium chloride, pure salt, and salt, when specifically combined with the natural, creeping moisture of the damp, unventilated cell and the constant oxygen flowing in the freezing air, is the ultimate natural enemy of forged iron. It acts as an aggressive, relentless chemical catalyst for oxidation. It forces the incredibly rigid, impenetrable metal to violently break down at a microscopic level, slowly turning it into weak, brittle rust. It causes solid, unbreakable iron to slowly decay, soften, and eventually crumble into weak, reddish-brown, flaky dust. Shiratori sat in the pitch-black darkness, staring down at the massive, immovable iron bolts securing his 20-kilogram handcuffs. He looked up at the thick, heavy iron frame of the food inspection slit bolted securely onto his heavy steel door. He realized a profound, world-altering truth right then and there. He did not need a smuggled metal saw to cut his way out of this hell. He did not need a sophisticated lockpick or outside help. He just needed unbroken patience, and he needed time. And trapped alone in solitary confinement, with the rest of his life stretching out before him, time was the only endless resource he had left. So began the most agonizing, impossibly patient, and psychologically brutal prison break in all of recorded human history. Imagine, if you can, the sheer psychotic discipline required to pull off this completely silent, invisible sabotage. Your stomach is constantly, violently screaming in absolute agony from near starvation. The freezing, sub-zero air is constantly biting and tearing at your exposed, bleeding skin, begging your weakened body for any possible source of heat. But instead of eagerly, desperately swallowing the warm, life-sustaining liquid, you hold it back. You carefully, deliberately take a small mouthful of the salty miso broth, and you hold it securely in your cheeks. You sit perfectly still in the dark, freezing corner of your cell, completely motionless, expertly pretending to be a thoroughly broken, defeated man. You wait patiently for the heavily armed guards to finish their routine patrol. You listen intently, with the ears of a hunted animal, to the heavy, rhythmic thud of their winter boots slowly fading away down the long, icy, echoing corridor. When the dead, heavy silence finally returns to the isolated cell block, you slowly, painfully tilt your head down toward your heavily chained wrists. You meticulously, carefully spit a few precious, measured drops of the salty soup directly onto the heavy, customized iron screws that hold the massive handcuffs together. You make absolutely, perfectly sure that not a single precious drop misses its intended microscopic target. You do not make a single sound. You gently, carefully wipe away any excess moisture with your rags so the observant guards will never ever notice the wet spots during their next inspection. Then, you sit back up, returning to your frozen posture, and you wait in the agonizing darkness until the next meal. This was the grueling, mind-bending daily reality for Yoshie Shiratori. Every single day for 8 agonizing, endless months, he flawlessly repeated this bizarre, desperate, and brilliant ritual. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner. 3 times a day, without fail, he willingly transformed his own starving body into a living, breathing vessel for silent chemical warfare. The heavily armed guards would occasionally suspiciously peer through the tiny food slit to check on their prized prisoner. They looked at the shivering, pathetic man sitting quietly in the darkest corner, tightly huddled under his thin, inadequate cotton blanket. They saw a thoroughly defeated, broken prisoner who had finally, permanently given up fighting the system. They absolutely did not see the microscopic, unstoppable destruction happening right in front of their very own eyes. They did not understand the terrifying, silent science of the impossible. Over the grueling course of 240 days, the high sodium content of the daily miso soup began to steadily work its dark, corrosive, irreversible magic. The harsh, incredibly damp, and constantly freezing environment of the Abashiri solitary confinement cell actually served to violently accelerate the chemical oxidation process. The once incredibly shiny, impenetrable iron bolts on his heavy cuffs began to slowly change color, turning a dark, rusty, reddish-brown. The rigid, unforgiving metal started to soften, slowly flaking away layer by microscopic layer. But freeing his hands was only the very first agonizing part of this impossible, complex equation. Shiratori, a master of escapes, knew that having his hands free was completely, utterly useless if he could not physically get out of the heavily fortified cell itself. The solid steel door was locked heavily and securely from the outside. The walls were made of incredibly thick brick and solid stone. The only potential, theoretical way out of the tomb was the tiny food inspection slit. It was a minuscule rectangular opening, a hole so incredibly small that a normal, healthy person could barely fit their human head through it, let alone their entire torso and body. And it was heavily framed by thick, forged iron brackets, bolted incredibly tightly deep into the solid steel door. So, Shiratori did not just spit his soup on his handcuffs. Whenever he was physically close enough to the heavy door, whenever the guards were occupied or distracted at the far distant end of the long cell block, he would carefully, silently apply the salty broth directly to the thick screws holding the food slit frame securely in place. This required an agonizing, terrifying level of precision and absolute risk. If a single guard ever noticed the brown rust forming on the outside of the doorframe, his entire painstaking plan would be ruined instantly. He would be violently executed, or even worse, chained even tighter and thrown into a deeper, darker hole. He had to meticulously, perfectly clean the visible outer parts of the screws, intentionally leaving the moisture and rust to silently, aggressively eat away at the internal, hidden threads where the guards could not possibly see. The psychological, mental toll of this endless waiting game was completely unimaginable to a normal human mind. Imagine holding your breath, suppressing your every single human instinct for 240 long days. One single cough at the wrong time, one careless slip of the tongue, one fleeting moment of physical weakness, and he was a dead man. The intense, constant physical pain of the 20-kilogram iron weights constantly, viciously tore at his flesh, causing his wrists and ankles to openly bleed, fester, and scar over again and again and again. The lethal cold of the brutal Hokkaido winter seeped deep, permanently into his achy bones. Yet, against all human logic, he endured. His incredibly sharp mind was locked entirely onto a singular, burning, obsessive goal: absolute freedom. He closed his eyes in the pitch black and vividly visualized the microscopic rust aggressively eating through the iron structure. He literally felt the massive bolts getting microscopically, slightly weaker with every passing, agonizing week. And by the end of the 8th long month, in the dead freezing night of August 1944, the absolutely impossible had finally, quietly happened. The incredibly thick, custom-forged iron screws that secured his heavy, unbreakable restraints were completely, totally corroded. The internal threads were entirely eaten away by the relentless, silent salt. The core structural integrity of the heavy metal had completely, utterly collapsed. Shiratori silently tested the massive bolts with his bare, heavily bleeding, frost-bitten fingers. They shifted. They moved. The 20-kilogram chains that were explicitly designed to hold him securely until the day he finally died were now absolutely nothing more than broken, rusty, useless toys. He had secretly, brilliantly freed himself right under the noses of his arrogant captors. But he did not foolishly take them off immediately. He patiently waited. He needed the absolute perfect chaotic moment to strike. He needed the awesome destructive cover of nature. He needed a massive storm. In the dark, freezing abyss of August 1944, the absolute perfect, terrifying opportunity finally arrived. A massive, historic blizzard violently struck the northern coast of Hokkaido. The freezing wind howled like a deeply wounded massive animal, violently slamming against the thick stone walls of Abashiri prison. The winter storm was so incredibly violent, so absolutely deafening, that the constant roaring wind and the crashing of the thunder perfectly masked all other sounds inside the isolated cell blocks. The heavily armed guards instinctively huddled closely together in their heavily heated guard rooms, desperately trying to stay warm, arrogantly assuming that no living human being could conceivably survive outside in such an apocalyptic, freezing whiteout. They were absolutely, fatally wrong. The raging, violent nature outside provided the perfect, impenetrable cover for his impossible escape. But actually escaping the solid iron cell required tearing his own physical body apart in ways that defy human comprehension. Shiratori sat silently in the pitch-black, freezing darkness of his solitary cell. The massive roar of the raging blizzard echoed endlessly through the cold concrete. He reached his scarred hands down and silently, firmly twisted the heavily rusted, weakened bolts of his massive leg irons. They finally gave way with a sickening metallic crunch. He slowly, painfully pulled the heavy, dark metal apart and slipped his deeply bruised, heavily bleeding ankles entirely free. He immediately did the exact same terrifying process to his wrists. The 20-kilogram, unbreakable shackles hit the freezing stone floor with a dull, heavy thud, perfectly masked completely by the rolling thunder outside. For the very first time in nearly a full, agonizing year, Yoshie Shiratori could actually stand up completely straight in the darkness. He could freely move his aching, scarred arms, but there was absolutely no time to celebrate this impossible victory. The real, unimaginable nightmare was just beginning. He walked slowly, purposefully over to the heavy, massive steel door. He firmly placed his bleeding fingers on the rusted iron frame of the tiny food slit. Thanks to the 8 long months of patient, relentless chemical corrosion, the heavy screws securely holding the frame were completely compromised and weak. With a sudden, incredibly violent surge of pure adrenaline and raw, desperate physical strength, he viciously ripped the heavy iron frame right out of the solid steel door. The tiny, terrifyingly small rectangular hole was now completely exposed to the freezing air. It was merely a fraction of the actual size of a grown adult man's shoulders. The human skeletal system is absolutely not designed to compress or fold. The solid collarbones, the heavy rib cage, the complex shoulder joints, they are rigidly fixed, permanent structures to physically push a human torso through a solid steel hole that, incredibly small, completely defies every single known law of human biology and physics. But Yoshie Shiratori was beyond desperate. He was a man driven by a psychotic, burning need for freedom. He quickly stripped off his thin, freezing prison uniform to completely reduce any possible physical friction. He stood completely naked and vulnerable in the freezing dark cell. He slowly, agonizingly squeezed his human head through the tiny, rough opening. The freezing, jagged metal violently scraped against his face and neck. His head barely fit through, but his broad, muscular shoulders immediately jammed hard against the unforgiving steel edges of the door. This is the exact terrifying moment where literally any other normal sane man would completely instantly give up. The blinding, agonizing pain of the solid metal mercilessly crushing against the fragile collarbones would be absolutely, totally unbearable. But Shiratori simply took a deep, freezing breath. He violently braced his bare legs against the inside of the heavy door. And then, he did the truly, horrifyingly unthinkable. Using pure, unadulterated brute force and a terrifying, intimate knowledge of his own physical anatomy, he deliberately, forcefully dislocated both of his own shoulders. The loud, wet, popping sound of solid bone violently separating from the shoulder socket was absolutely sickening. Without the rigid width of his shoulders blocking the way, his bleeding torso became unnaturally, horrifyingly malleable. He pushed forward with everything he had. The jagged, completely rusted edges of the torn iron frame sliced deeply and mercilessly into his bare, freezing back and chest. Warm human blood, violently mixed with the freezing, howling wind, instantly turning to crimson, solid ice on his pale skin. Inch by agonizing, terrifying inch, he writhed and twisted like a desperate snake. He forcefully dragged his collapsing, flexible ribcage through the impossible tiny gap. His bleeding hips scraped violently against the cold steel, and then, against all human logic and reason, he was through. He fell heavily onto the completely frozen, snow-covered ground outside the cell block, completely naked, heavily bleeding, and with both of his arms hanging loosely and uselessly from their ruined joints. He was finally out of the cell, but he was still trapped entirely inside the massive perimeter walls of Abashiri, and the lethal blizzard was raging at its absolute terrifying peak. The temperature was dropping incredibly fast. To stay still for even a few minutes meant freezing to death instantly. Shiratori violently slammed his ruined shoulders against the freezing concrete wall, forcing the heavy bones back into their torn sockets with a sickening, wet crunch. He stood up in the knee-deep, freezing snow. The howling, violent wind was completely blinding. The massive searchlights from the tall guard towers were entirely useless, completely swallowed by the heavy whiteout conditions of the apocalyptic storm. He brilliantly used the lethal blizzard as his own personal freezing cloak. He scaled a massive perimeter wall, his bare, bleeding hands instantly freezing to the rough brick, his numb feet finding impossible holds. He disappeared entirely into the unforgiving, freezing wilderness of Hokkaido, leaving absolutely nothing behind but a pair of completely rusted 20-kilogram iron shackles and an empty, frozen steel cell. When the gray, freezing dawn finally broke, the massive storm eventually subsided. The heavily armed guards walked slowly down the quiet, freezing corridor for their mandatory morning inspection. They fully expected to see the broken, defeated man curled up in the darkest corner of his cell. Instead, they looked through the empty food slit and saw absolutely nothing. The secure cell was completely, terrifyingly empty. Absolute panic immediately set in. They frantically unlocked the heavy, massive steel door and rushed violently inside. On the freezing floor lay the completely impossible, horrifying truth: the invincible, custom-forged 20-kilogram handcuffs, specifically designed and forged to hold the greatest escape artist in all of Japan, were lying wide open. The heavy, unbreakable screws were completely eaten away by rust. The heavy iron frame of the reinforced door was violently ripped out and discarded. The guards stood in absolute, stunned silence. They finally, horrifyingly realized that they had never ever been breaking Yoshie Shiratori. He had been slowly, silently breaking their entire invincible prison, one single patient drop of soup at a time. The entire Japanese prison system was instantly plunged into absolute, terrified shock. The completely inescapable frozen fortress of Abashiri had been successfully breached by a naked man who had absolutely nothing. The unbelievable true story of the miso soup escape spread like absolute wildfire across the country. It was a completely humiliating, devastating defeat for the proud authorities, but a legendary, immortal triumph of pure human will and intellect. Yoshie Shiratori brilliantly proved to the entire world that no matter how much heavy iron you pile on a man, no matter how impossibly cold you make his dark cell, you can absolutely never, ever chain a human mind that is entirely determined to be free. He demonstrated the terrifying, quiet power of endless patience, the slow, absolutely unstoppable force of basic science, and the absolute terrifying limits of human physical endurance. He is eternally remembered today, not just as a brilliant criminal, but as the undisputed king of escapes. A terrifying genius who calmly looked at an impenetrable, freezing wall and saw absolutely nothing but a simple puzzle waiting patiently to be solved. Now ask yourself this terrifying question. Could you possibly survive 8 agonizing months in a freezing dark hole without going completely insane? Could you possess the psychotic, endless patience to silently corrode solid iron with absolutely nothing but your dinner? And would you honestly have the sheer, brutal, terrifying willpower to violently rip your own bones completely out of their sockets just for a single taste of the freezing, deadly wind? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to dive even deeper into the brilliant minds of history's greatest, most terrifying escape artists and the most absolutely impossible prison breaks ever recorded in human history, you absolutely must hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on your notifications so you never, ever miss a terrifying story. Because next time on Prison Break Stories, we are heading directly to a maximum security, shark-infested island where 3 desperate men used absolutely nothing but stolen raincoats and sharpened spoons to completely vanish into the freezing dark ocean, never to be seen again. You will absolutely not want to miss the dark, hidden secrets of Alcatraz. Stay tuned, stay endlessly curious, and never, ever underestimate the terrifying, unstoppable power of the human mind.